Last 25 years, when you and I were building things, code played a huge role. It's almost human design and human code. This next decade is about how, without programming, we use data to code. So most of the machine learning systems and AI systems are about that.
Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Anand and this is the Insights podcast series from Accel. On this show, we offer a straight talk on entrepreneurship, business, and self-improvement through stories and conversations with some of the most brilliant startup founders, business thinkers, and industry leaders around the world. This is our 65th episode, and if you want to learn more about us or check out our show notes, head on to our website, SeedToScale.com/insights after listening to this podcast. My first guest is someone I've known for more than a decade, Murali Aravumdan, the founder and CEO of Inference, a deep tech AI company disrupting healthcare. He's a serial entrepreneur and has had successful exits with two media and telecom companies, Vivio and Winforia Networks, prior to starting Inference. He also has an impeccable record of authoring 115 US patents across machine learning, AI, data networking, telephony, and recently even computational biology. Joining him today as the second guest is Radhika Ananth, Vice President at Accel and my colleague who focuses on digital health and biotech investments for us. We kickstart this episode by talking about the biggest gaps in healthcare as they exist today and how AI is poised to bridge some of these gaps. We then look back at Murali's past life as an electrical engineer turned entrepreneur and why he decided to pursue a career in healthcare. We dive deeper into the AI in healthcare landscape, opportunities, and some of the challenges. Finally, we close by discussing the prospects for founders building a healthcare business from India and some critical advice for them from our speakers. Hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. Welcome to the podcast, Murali and Radhika. It's such a pleasure to have you both. Murali from Boston, Radhika from wherever you are. Radhika, is it Bangalore or Chennai this time?
Bangalore.
Okay. And good morning, Murali. Yeah, so great. So we're going to get right into the podcast. So today we're going to be discussing digital health broadly and specifically application of AI in health. So Radhika, I want to start with you first. What are some of the large problems faced by the healthcare ecosystem and how does AI help in solving those problems? Maybe you can start with that broad question.
Thank you, Adi. Thanks for having me on your show. I'm looking forward to talking
Show.
to you.
This is the first time someone's called this a show. Thank you. Yeah, cool. Yeah.
We all know the apparent macro problems, the lack of access to affordable and quality care. Access would include inadequate resources and skewed demand-supply distribution. And the factors impeding quality would be lack of standardization, diagnosis is error-prone, and unevolved care management. The care that's being provided has not evolved at all the last many, many decades, right? And finally, the rising costs and poor healthcare financial coverage and low insurance penetration. So digital and tech, like AI, is bound to democratize healthcare and any holistic care model. And over time, we hope that it will support in proactive care and reactive care. And to your question on how AI can solve them, it's good to understand what the white spaces are and how we can address them with technology and particularly AI. For example, bridging acute radiology shortage through tele-solutions and deep learning to do the time-consuming tasks of normal report annotation and report generation, and also provide more precision-driven diagnosis using pathology images, right? Another example is inspired from our day in and day out things that we use, the push notification systems on our phone, right? So what does digital therapeutics do? It uses these nudges and reminders, which are powered by AI, to manage chronic conditions like diabetes, hypertension, obesity, etc. And finally, this is my personal favorite. AI is playing a powerful role in supercharging the drug discovery and drug development world by simulating a vast majority of experiments on computers. So I would like to close off with, think of an engine sitting on top of patient data, churning out relevant insights for all the stakeholders. Providers act as collection centers and eventually make efficient clinical decisions using the support systems that AI provides. And then payers are able to underwrite risks better and customize their offerings. And pharma and research labs can draw insights from all the data that AI provides and come up with better drug delivery. So I can't imagine another system being able to do this besides AI.
Great. Thank you. That's a good segue to getting Murali on the show, as you called it. Right. So, Murali, maybe welcome again. And maybe just for the listeners, we go back for more than a decade when you are an entrepreneur in a completely different industry or just exiting. So, you've been a successful serial entrepreneur from media and telco, other industries prior to turning your attention to healthcare in 2013, right? So maybe just walk us through starting with that, like what made you pick this industry for the audience who are listening from different sectors, right? You were a successful entrepreneur, you could have gone on in those industries. Why healthcare at that time?
Yeah. So, Ananth, first, thank you so much for inviting me to your show as Radhika.
Yeah.
So, it's for people who didn't know me or don't know me, unlike you. I started my career as an engineer, electrical engineer, but I would call myself as a programmer than anything else. So, starting in the 90s at Bell Labs, worked on various telecom systems, and then did a company in wireless soft switching, and then another company in media, doing silly things like talking to your television. So when you fast forward and come 2013, I had the pleasure of meeting my nephew again, which is Venki. And Venki had done his PhD in MIT, and he was pondering what to do. And it turns out to be the right time. So I was an angel investor for Venki. And I said, I will moonlight as a programmer so I can understand what this biology thing is about. That's how it happened 7 years back. And
Got it.
around the time, I was still in the middle of selling my previous company called Vivio. So 2015. So in earnest, I would say last 5 years, 4.5 to 5 years is what I would say Inference as a company has emerged. So, and the most fundamental reason for my excitement is the explosion of digital data, starting off with the digitization of biology fundamentally, which is the notion of the Human Genome Project, where we spent as a country $3 billion for sequencing 3 billion base pairs. So it's almost $1 per base pair. And if you look at that to see how much the whole genome costs today, it costs $1,000. So the explosion of digitization, because of the cost reduction, if you put that cost reduction in a curve, that exponent of that cost reduction is better than what Anand, you and I are always familiar with, the Moore's law. It's the reduction in cost is so dramatic. So that digitization, coupled with the fact that digitization of electronic medical records itself, where more and more care became digital and it got recorded, those two things, and with the explosion of scientific literature, is what made all the things that I learned while doing silly companies like search and recommendations for TV, all those things to be equally applicable in solving something very meaningful problems in life. And I'm a big fan, as you can tell us, most high-tech companies are, about Elon Musk and Tesla and so on and so forth, or Jeff Bezos. If you want to go to Mars, first you need to conquer human body on Earth. So biology, this is the century of biology. Yes, we can go to space, but we need to conquer biology. If you want to conquer biology, lots of things that we do not know at all, that has to first we understand. First, we have to digitize those, the entire human analog phenomenon. And that is what really excited me to come here.
That's awesome. So for the audience, maybe if you can explain what is the thesis behind Inference, what do you do, what's the current status, that'll be super helpful.
Yeah. So Inference, as I said initially, started off as a fun project where I thought it might be an expensive biology lesson for me. So, and it turned out to be the most fascinating company that I have ever had a chance of being part of. So, at somewhat, I would say immodestly, we would like to claim what we want to do is to make biomedical knowledge computable. And it's a very tall thing to say. What does it mean to say, but making knowledge computable? So knowledge comes in different forms. At the most fundamental form, it's in written papers and so on. So in biology, scientists have always shared their insights as long papers and abstracts. So you might have all heard of IBM Watson, who did this several years back using the previous generation originally and pioneered the early building of this Jeopardy-like systems to say, how can I make sense of the literature, right? So that notion is a very big aspect of making biomedical knowledge computable. And what makes Inference different from lots of other things that I myself have done in the past, which used classical machine learning techniques and so on, is the last 3-4 years, there has been a renaissance in deep learning as you apply to text, right? So the notion of automatic translation that Google does or Facebook does and all of those kinds of things, all of that there is a very fundamental notion of auto-encoding and self-supervised neural networks that are providing very interesting set of results, which in the past required enormous rule-based systems which will constantly break. Or the neural networks will do fairly trivial things, wouldn't do what humans could do. So when I say humans, I don't mean from a deep sense of consciousness or any such thing. Tasks that a human being could do very quickly. So now the excitement of that kind of deep learning neural networks, coupled with this explosion of digital corpora that's available to us in terms of all published literature, scientific papers, clinical trials that are conducted, along with digitized clinical records. That makes for a very, very interesting mix to essentially make this task of making biomedical knowledge computable. And the reason why you want to make it computable is the kind of thing Radhika alluded to. If you want to improve care, you need to come up with new therapeutics. You need to come up with new diagnostics. But how would you come up with new diagnostics or therapeutics? You got to learn from what we know already. And this notion of learning what we know is what Inference really, truly enables, right? Of course, we stand on the shoulders of giants of Google, Facebook, and a range of people in the university, professors, Jeffrey Hinton, and so on, who pioneered the notion of deep learning, the neural networks. But we believe, with respect to synthesizing the biomedical knowledge, we have something very unique to offer by integrating at the lowest layer all possible knowledge that is encoded in text in various sources and triangulating that with molecular sources like DNA, RNA, proteins, and so on, as well as clinical data where patients whose clinical care has been recorded, whether that is physician notes, whether it is structured database records that tells they got admitted now, they got released some other time, these are the drugs that they took and so on, or electrocardiograms, the raw electrocardiogram waveforms, the raw pathology images, all kinds of things which are all what I would call unstructured data. The notion of deriving knowledge from unstructured data and structured data and triangulating across all of this together is at the heart of what Inference is trying to solve.
Got it. So I have a confession to make. Biology was never my strong subject, right? So Radhika knows that already. So I'd love for you to explain to me in a way that it's easy, like one of the applications, like I understand that there's a lot of this data, DNA data, the paper data, everything that you're sucking in using AI and neural networks and everything. But maybe like for me to understand what are the applications? Why does this matter so much? or what's the impact that you think this can create? When you say biomedical knowledge computable, right? Can you
So,
explain to me in a context?
so
Yeah.
since most of your audience would be, I would assume, would know about programming.
Programming, yes, yeah.
Yeah,
Biology will be the
programming.
problem. Just kidding.
Yeah. So, and hence I'm going to give the
Yeah,
programming analogy.
yeah.
So, imagine an alien civilization who did not know anything about us, dropped on Earth, and they see this Zoom program running on a Macintosh or a PC, doesn't matter. Their job is somehow to figure out what is this thing? What does it do? Of course, they know, if some other camera, some other person is standing there, I'm seeing the same person here. So they can say, it is, if I talk, something is getting recorded and something can be played back. At the highest level, they get to see what happens. And human biology is like that, right? We walk, we talk, we do various kinds of things. Those observations has been collected over eons as Ayurveda 2000 years back, or in more modern medical science in the last 100 or so years. But they are all called phenotypes. At the highest level, what we do. So if you get cut, we bleed. It's so obvious what the thing is. But it doesn't tell you, just like the alien who saw the Zoom application, doesn't tell you there was an Intel chip inside. And the Intel chip uses the stored program notion, the von Neumann notion of fetch, decode, execute happens. Those kinds of things, it's all black box, right? So magically, somehow, somebody did some reverse engineering and said, hey, we know the microprocessor. That is key. If I remove the microprocessor, the entire PC doesn't even boot. Everything stands. So it must be too important. And that is how medicine has progressed. What happens is, because of sick people, some organ would not work. That's how we would know that organ is important. So by knocking things off, it is exactly equivalent to aliens taking apart your PC. Ultimately, to understand what is an application program, what is an operating system, what is hardware, where is the hard disk controller is, and so on and so forth. And we do this completely by reverse engineering, right? And this reverse engineering, over time, the last 50 years, we understood, there is this notion of a very fundamental code. It is like getting the opcode, assuming the Intel opcode. It's a move instruction, it's a push pop instruction, and so on and so forth. And that equivalent is what we knew fundamentally in biology. Okay, there is this 4-letter things instead of zeros and ones, A, T, C, and G, which makes up a big code. And that code happens to create something called amino acids, which create something called proteins. And the proteins assemble with various other kinds of things into biological cells. So at the lowest level, our task is, or the biologist's task is to say, how do I make sense of this opcode that I know in the Intel processor and somehow tie it to the Zoom? And if I fiddle around with the frame buffer, they say, hey, the screen changed somewhere. And that is the level of tinkering that has to happen. And that's how we are learning. And that has been a very slow and painful process. Now, in the last 20 years, ever since the human genome sequencing and various other digital characterization of the various underlying molecular products have become better and better and better, it's equivalent to building enormous amount of reverse engineering tools in computation in the 1980s and 70s and 80s. And that essentially causes in the 90s lots of interesting things to happen. And that is the equivalent thing. Our notion of a computer program is what our human genetic code is. It's your static code. As a computer programmer, you would say code segment, BSS, and that is your static DNA code. Then there is some product called RNA, which is like your runtime expression. So the eye, your retina, has to behave differently than your skin or your nail. How does it happen? Even though the code is the same. So it is equivalent to saying my operating system has all my code and memory, but the payroll program is running a different part of the code than my windowing system or my Zoom system. And that is what we are trying to figure out with this RNA and proteins. So this notion of DNA, RNA, proteins, when you tie it to what you observe is like Zoom or payroll programming, payroll processing program. That notion is, some person is sick, some person has cancer, some person has diabetes, or somebody got infected with COVID. And to triangulate that, we understand more of the body. Of course, you would understand science progress when you have more data. And the more and more data that we are collecting on different silos, you need to integrate tightly. And that is, if you do that, the same kind of explosion of digital explosion that you saw, like what people would call Cambrian explosion that happened for life. It's the digital explosion we see in the last 20 years with the internet. That kind of possibility exists in the next 100 years for biology. That's what's exciting about it.
Awesome. Thank you. That was a great analogy and great way to explain. Maybe the last question to you, and then I want to go back to discussing the broader AI landscape, is maybe like you explained the whole computer analogy and the whole ecosystem there. So what are some of the exciting applications, the Zoom equivalents of your world? What's coming?
Yeah. So, health is a very generic thing, right? All of us want to be healthy. So it ranges from little children all the way to very senior people. So COVID-19 is an example as a thing. So when COVID-19 initially started happening, in the past, it would have been unthinkable. Within 3 weeks or 4 weeks, we could detect symptoms. For example, many people who get infected with COVID-19 have something called loss of sense or smell. So loss of sense or smell, which is called anosmia, is the scientific name. And that, in the past, people did not know that's a symptom for COVID. And in the past, in influenza time or some other infectious disease time, such knowledge would have taken 2-3 years to accumulate. And that happened in our case in 3, 4, 5 weeks. Why? We have this deep partnership with Mayo Clinic. So we get access to all the electronic data. And because of our neural networks, we could understand the sentiment of the notes that the physicians are writing, from which we could extract this information and to say, hey, there's a common symptom that we are getting, which is this lack of sense of smell. And remember, there is a notion when you make it into structured databases, there is this notion there has to be a database field and the field has to be coded in some particular fashion. Of course, there was no code for sense of smell because biology had not encountered that as a very, very big problem in the past. So there was no such code. But because physicians write it as is, and we could extract such a thing, it is possible. And now this is a standard test, what CDC would say. If you as a consumer is feeling lack of sense or smell, please quarantine yourself. And that knowledge would not have happened. And that kind of knowledge cannot happen only in the sense of smell itself. It is possible, you can imagine the next set of devices which would automatically, some chip will smell it. You don't have to know that you lost a sense of smell. Some other chip will tell you lost a sense of smell. Digital things. And couldn't you imagine that automatically sending a notification to something? So you can imagine a range of new digital devices that will, sensory devices, I would say, whether it's your skin current or various kinds of sensory devices. All of those will add to your phenotypes. And because of the fact that we can now understand your genotype, your underlying molecular constitution or cellular constitution, it is possible to predict something is going to happen to you 2 years from now, 3 years from now, and intervene sooner. So, and by the way, this is all not theoretical. For example, there is a deadly disease called pulmonary hypertension, which is your lung and the heart that are connected through this thing called pulmonary artery. If that thickens, your blood cannot be pumped very well. And this causes blood pressure. That's why it's called hypertension. And this, if for some people, if you don't diagnose it soon enough, people will die within 2 years. But if you diagnose it enough, it is possible to intervene via good medical interventions. And those drugs can extend the life by 7-8 years. You can imagine there are 8,000 or 10,000 such kinds of conditions. There is no way you could have done it in the past without AI and deep learning kind of thing. The amount of data, because most of the biology problems, to use a favorite computer science analogy from complexity theory, most of the biology problems, right, almost invariably any problem that you ask will be a NP-complete problem. What do I mean by that? The number of input cases will be more than the number of hydrogen atoms in the universe. And the only way you could conquer this is by getting information from as many different sources, whether digital sensors, electrocardiograms, or pathology images, and tying it to higher level observations of how the patient feels or how the individual, you and I, feel. And all of this, if you integrate it, then the notion of predicting things that will happen can really inform care, long-term care, chronic care, or acute care, and it can dramatically improve the productivity. As Radhika mentioned, one of the biggest challenges is 20% of GDP in America goes to healthcare. Just not sustainable. We need to find out more and more and more technology to solve this problem. And I see AI as one way to do it.
Awesome. That's a good segue to Radhika. So back to you on why is AI in interesting category for investors, and why specifically now? I think a lot of the setup has been done by Murali, but love to get
I
your
know.
perspective. Yeah,
Maybe I can explain what the focus areas for Accel are really.
sure. That'll be helpful. Yeah.
So focus areas for Accel are AI in diagnostics, drug discovery, precision medicine, and digital therapeutics. So the way we went about to double click on these categories amongst a few more it was based on the industry spend and the importance of using AI in these areas. So for example, data and lab costs account for about 55% of pharma R&D, which consists of about $200 billion. And biotech drugs, as we call it, biologics, constitute for 35% of all drugs in the drug development pipeline. So here we see AI unlocking value through three key levers, right? One is in the in vitro stage, before in vitro actually, novel discoveries, then in vitro trials. In vitro meaning experiments that are done on cell cultures and animal models, and then finally in clinical trials. So AI we see helps in simulating complex experiments in silico. In silico is on computer, instead of conducting them in vitro. And in clinical trials, particularly RWEs, use real-world evidence of data where we can use to better the drugs, and also in identifying and recruiting, stratifying the right patient population for clinical trials has happened in the drug development universe. The other area that's interesting for us is digital therapeutics, which combines your telemedicine, disease management platform, algorithms, IoT devices, and machine learning to create evidence-based solutions and yield better outcomes, right? So then the solutions also use biomarkers to be able to point out how the patients have improved in their health using drugs plus these digital therapeutics. So for example, how we would figure out if it's further interesting is that, say we have 75 million diabetes patients in India, and an average spend per patient is about $100. Again, in India, makes it about a 7 billion market. It's a large market opportunity. But how much of that, how many of them are transacting online, right, to manage care? And where can AI be used? And how it can be used is there. But are people really going to take care that way? We are yet to see that play out in India. We see that play out really well in the US, right? And examples for those are Livongo models, Verta, and so on. And we've also recently made an investment, which is for a global market, and we're yet to announce that investment, which is also in chronic care and obesity. So the markets have to be large, and in the US, the markets are naturally large. Also, the spend for the patient there is about $9,000, $10,000 per year, whereas here it's $100, right? And insurance driven here, where it's all out of pocket. So you ask the patients to add another technology, another way to manage care. They're going to be skeptical. Whereas in the US, that cost is taken care by the insurance companies. So we'll have to see how these things play out, but this is how we've largely looked and categorized our focus areas.
Got it. So just to summarize and ensure I got, so the broader drug discovery side, there's a lot of scope there. And then on the digital therapeutics, particularly in the chronic care side, right, you see a lot of value. And from India going global, and maybe I want to come to that, maybe double click on that in just a little bit. But I want to get you in on this as well, Murali. Anything that you see, any opportunities in AI outside of inference that you think are exciting for the audience that are listening? Yeah.
I would say on the big notion, again, I would say is in the last 25 years, when you and I were building things 10 years back, code played a huge role. It's almost human design and human code. This next decade is about how, without programming, we use data to code. So most of the machine learning systems and AI systems are about that. That is such a broad, almost von Neumann-like notion, right? That's a very important notion. Coding without coding. That is generating programs without explicit code. And that notion, wherever in the past human beings did something within few seconds, what a human being could happen in few seconds, I say all of those tasks are automatable, starting with driverless cars. And that's not just driverless cars, or various kinds of standard tasks that you think for an insurance company that has to do claim automation. Most of the processes are manual processes. You could imagine several steps, not all of them, but several steps, which would take human beings few seconds to do without thought. In the past, you couldn't do rule-based code and do a scalable system that will do well. Now with the AI, you could automate those. So education is a huge area where we still have to figure out how. That's one hugely untouched area, even though you may see distance learning, this, that, and all that. We still haven't figured out how to make our kids smarter very fast, right? So that's a huge area, but it's a great area of research and how such tools have to happen. So I see enormous opportunity for young entrepreneurs or old ones like me, I would say, to think deeply about some of this, to change the trajectory in the next 20 years, 30 years.
Got it. Sorry, I just want to stick with healthcare though. I agree with you. There is application of AI in every industry. But if you stick with healthcare itself, are there any areas that we didn't talk about that you think has huge potential? Because you have a vantage point. Yeah.
Every aspect of healthcare. So in fact, the way we call what inference wants to enable, we say for pharmaceutical companies, we would say we want to enable them to go from atoms to claims. And what do I mean by that? Atoms at the lowest level, as Radhika was talking about in vitro experiments, even before the in vitro experiments, you're talking about my small molecule, will it modulate, not modulate? That is an exponential search space problem, right? So AI naturally will take place there. How do you, from millions and millions of more preclinical molecules, how do I get to 5 molecules that's worthwhile advancing? Then, if you go to the next stage, from preclinical stage to animal model testing, again, they will call lead optimization, to hit to lead, and then lead optimization. How could I do that? Again, I can see AI playing a huge role. Then from lead optimization to animal models, and then animal models to phase 1, to phase 2, to phase 3. Every aspect, there is so much unknown variables, and there are enough data that we are generating. So AI will play a role in every aspect of a pharma process. Now, I only described a pharmaceutical company. For example, one big aspect that we work with our pharma customers is this thing called life cycle management. As they sell a product, sell a drug already in the market, then just like Windows 3.1 has to become Windows 95, has to become Windows 10, they ask the question, what is the next disease I'm going to add to my FDA label? And today, that's a very key opinion leader-driven problem. Can AI help? Of course it can, right? So if you look at Salesforce.com and the CRM systems in pharma, there's a company called Viva that does a fabulous job. And that data and those kinds of things not only can lead to Salesforce automation, it can feed back into lifecycle management. So it may say, oh, there is an off-label prescription possibility. So that should go back and feed back, and which in the past would have taken years to get to 4, can happen in months or weeks. So I see there is no limit just within, if you look at the pharma life cycle. But moving away from pharma, healthcare as a broad theme, in hospitals, as we work with Mayo Clinic, Mayo is our strategic partner. There are several initiatives that we have, and the biggest one is, as you can imagine, is telemedicine, right? As care becomes virtual, whether it's acute care or chronic care, in both of these cases, how can we use new digital therapeutics, new digital medicine kind of thing? And how do you make it propagate, not just in very high quality academic medical centers like Mayo, but to propagate to community hospitals? So that is a very big challenge, but COVID has accelerated that trend. and I only see what would have usually taken 10, 20 years is now going to take 3 years or 4 years. So I'm very excited about the application of AI in almost every aspect of the life sciences ecosystem.
Got it. And each of these are very large markets and
Very large market.
and opportunities. So let's switch gears and talk about some of the challenges, right? What are some of the challenges of adoption of AI, right? Murali, from your point of view, vantage point of view, any thoughts on that, as well as once adopted, what are the other key challenges that you see?
There are multiple challenges, as in any new technology, right?
Yeah.
There are multiple challenges. So as entrepreneurs, we are eternally optimistic. So we will think something will happen within the next 2-3 years. And we always tend to be wrong. It takes much longer. But on the overall long-term front, we are always tend to underestimate. It happens when it catches up, it scales to such a big level. So that's the way I see in AI's trajectory also. There are 2-3 things that Radhika alluded to, which is a very, very valid point. The notion of transparency and explainable AI becomes very important so that people don't, otherwise they'll say, oh, this machine is telling, should I trust? Should I not trust? So we spend a lot of time in figuring out whether it is ECG-based diagnosis, how do we make it explainable to doctors so the physicians can feel comfort as to why they should trust that particular result, right? Or in various other decision support things where it may be just the end consumer, you're doing a nudge. Even for that, right? Ultimately, you want to build trust by being transparent and being explainable. So it's not an easy problem. AI suffers from one particular issue, including this includes us, because data is king, right? So you learn whatever you can learn from the data, but how you collected the data has bias in it, right? So for example, the Mayo database, that Mayo data that we have, is predominantly Caucasian population. So 80%, it's the nature of the beast. 80% of the data that we have is a Caucasian thing. So there is an inbuilt notion of lack of diversity that could cause certain bias in the way our neural networks will work. So we consciously try to address it by working with other academic medical centers or inner city hospitals to add extra data to say, hey, this is how we address it. This is how we remove some of the bias, some of the things. So transparency, explainability, all becomes very key. And we shouldn't oversell the technology at one level. All said and done, right? We are moving vectors in the n-dimensional space. That's all we know. We don't do what a 5-year-old can do. You don't need 10,000 images of cats and dogs to teach your 5-year-old to distinguish a cat from a dog. Forget about a 3-year-old. We'll do it in the third dog. Yeah. They will know it's a dog. So that notion, we are not there yet. So we have to build various kinds of systems to not get biased by the underlying probability distribution, think about reasoning. All of those things have to work hand in hand with the ecosystem of physicians, practitioners, and get them comfortable with the notion machines can actually augment the decision making.
That's great. So that leads me to my last question on this section. Maybe what are some of the limitations of AI? From maybe I'll start with Radhika and then have to come back to you, Murali. So what are some of the limitations we have seen?
When you say limitations, do you mean
in any of the aspects? It's as Murali pointed out, it's still early in the development cycle, right? So what are some of the limitations that we see or you come across, right? So with any examples of this, right?
A hard question. I actually don't have answers for. I don't know if this is a limitation or a challenge. Like, how do we deal with liability in cases when AI fails, or how do we deal with sensitive health data? Right? Not quite sure how to look through this area.
Got it. So Murali, from your perspective, from as an operator, like, have you noticed any limitations of where are we in the
absolutely overall? Yeah. The key thing is to understand where the technology will work or will not work. So it's one of the key things that we say. So there is one particular process where we automatically synthesize from the clinic physician notes. Here are the phenotypes of the people and build a longitudinal record. Now we say there is uncertainty in our results. So anything that we say, we have to tell with uncertainty, right? Give very clear confidence intervals. This is what that particular statement means and so on. So when you do it that particular way, people who use on the other end, who are the consumers of it, will have to say, oh, there are all these limitations. So which is the reason why in the driverless cars, you are not getting autopilot directly, right? So there are several steps we have to do. So the notion that it is an augmentation for the next few years has to be repeatedly emphasized to our partners, to our customers, so that it's jointly we improve the state of the art. And I'll give you one example. It's not medical related. You all might have heard about a company called OpenAI. They have a fantastic neural network called GPT-3. So, by the way, Inference uses similar kind of transformers. So, they are generational networks. That's the difference here. But the GPT-3 is a kind of a thing which will make beautiful sentences, English sentences, that will look, it's really written by a human being, except it is not factual. So imagine a chat bot or something else you use with GPT-3 and it's giving you medical advice. It will give complete nonsense, but it will be framed very beautifully in English. So it will pass Turing test if your Turing test is, oh, a well-constructed English sentence happened. But it will not pass a common sense test. Do you see? But then you could argue, hey, many human beings could do the same thing. Yes, it can. But the key point is we will tolerate faults from human beings. We will not tolerate faults from machines.
Yeah, just like driverless cars, also the same, right? Humans make mistakes, and right.
Exactly.
So maybe last question from my side is we touched upon this, but what's the India advantage, and any other closing thoughts from both of you, right? So we're sitting out of here, and a lot of Indian entrepreneurs listening in. So I'd love to hear from maybe Radhika. You can go first, and then Murali, over to you. Yeah.
I think the National Digital Health Stack, the NDHM, is a strong catalyst combined with insurance, right? In general, we've been heavily out of pocket, and now because of COVID, there's a huge uptick in insurance. Along with that, the India advantage would be the tech talent, right? Engineering tech talent that we have. We see it all around us, particularly in Bangalore and Madras. So I don't see why we can't see more AI companies coming out of here, particularly
in healthcare.
AI in healthcare as well. Yes.
Got it. Murali, from your vantage point, you have both. You have Boston and India offices.
And by the way, we have a Bangalore office.
Bangalore, yeah.
It's bigger now. And the Bangalore office, I have to say, this is one of the conscious design that we have had in Inference, is we want science and engineering to work hand in hand. Biology and engineering to work hand in the interdisciplinary, biology and computer science to work hand in hand. And I have been very pleasantly surprised at the high quality biology talent we get also in India. In addition to computer science talent, obviously you and I know, India always produced great computer science talent, right? So human resources is, I would say, India's greatest advantage. It will continue to be the greatest advantage. I could, given how much data and computer science needs to work hand in hand with physicians. By the way, Indian physicians are fabulous. Some of the best physicians I know here come from this country, from India. So I can see what India has not done so far. Maybe the path mirrors computer applications. In the 90s, it was more outsourcing. In the 2000 and now 2010, now homegrown companies are doing fabulously well, like your own Flipkart and so on and so forth. I can see a similar trend happen in what is conventionally viewed as pure IP development, intellectual property development. Because of systems like nference kind of systems, and because the contract research organizations that have been built over the last 10, 15 years, India is not second to any other country with respect to doing the biology experiments itself, the assay development itself. So now if you put those things together with the right corporate structure, enter Accel, so it is possible to create new companies 5-10 years from now, you shouldn't be surprised if a blockbuster oncology drug, a bispecific antibody, came from one such company. And perhaps I would like to be involved in such a thing.
Awesome. On that really inspirational note, I really want to thank both of you for taking time. It's been very informational and educational for me, and I'm sure for the audience as well. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Murali. Thanks, Radhika.
Thanks, Ananth. Thanks, Radhika.
Thank you, Murali, and thanks, Anand.
Hope you enjoyed the chat with Murali, founder and CEO of Inference, and Radhika, my colleague from Accel, on the landscape, trends, opportunities, and challenges with AI in healthcare. For all those who are building or thinking of building a healthcare company from India, hope you found this conversation helpful and engaging. Don't forget to subscribe and share this podcast with your friends who you think might find this helpful. Thank you once again for tuning into the Insights podcast series, and a special call out to everyone who sent us their valuable feedback and love this year. We have been planning our speaker lineup and content for 2021, and we would love to hear from you. So please do send us your recommendations and suggestions on what we can do better. We are always listening to, so do let us know what you think via Twitter at Accel_India. Before I finish, wish you all a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year in advance from me and the entire team at Accel. Stay safe and see you again in 2021.